When Finland joined NATO, it shattered an illusion that Putin was trying to create. The Russian president's threats amounted to nothing. Finland thumbed its nose at Putin and did the one thing that he didn't want to see. But now, things are getting so much worse for Russia's president. Finland just sent Russia a dangerous nuclear message. The NATO alliance has been further strengthened. As for Putin, he's just learned that the nuclear threats that he likes to throw around so readily can be matched by a power much greater than Russia's. Hold on a second, you might be saying. We're going to stop you right there. Finland doesn't have nuclear weapons, so how could it present a nuclear threat to Russia? Good question. And you are right, Finland doesn't have nukes. But what it does have is a 1,335-kilometer border with Russia and membership in a collective defense organization that does bring plenty of nukes to a fight. And that's Putin's problem. Finland isn't saying that it will hit Russia with nuclear weapons, it's saying that, for the first time, it's going to allow nukes to be stationed on its territory, ready to strike at a moment's notice if Putin's threats transform from bluster into reality. On June 17th, Finnish lawmakers sat down to cast their votes on a new law that changes everything. And by a margin of 125 to 61, the vote passed. What this means is that Finland has just lifted a decades-long ban on nuclear weapons, which marks perhaps the largest shift in the country's military posture since World War II. The deepening integration with NATO is evident in this decision, but for Russia, the massive problem this decision poses is that it finally means that NATO has the opportunity to station nuclear weapons right on the border with Russia. This is Putin's worst nightmare. And it's not a decision that Finland has taken lightly. Taking to X in the wake of the vote, Finnish Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen said that this was a move that was a long time in the making. The overall nuclear weapons policy has been one of the most challenging issues in the Ministry of Defense during this parliamentary term. Years of study, discussions with nuclear weapons states and other allies, and assessments of how Finland's security can be best strengthened in NATO, he declared, as he labelled the decision essential to Finland's security and the wider NATO posture against Russia. The Finnish nuclear ban has been torn up. This decision paves the way for Finland to receive, transport, and facilitate the movement of nuclear weapons throughout its territory, which runs counter to the posture that it had held for years. Before the Ukraine war, Finland wanted to avoid antagonizing Russia. That's why it stayed out of NATO, and it's why nuclear weapons on Finnish territory weren't even being discussed. But everything changed after Putin launched his invasion. Now Russia is a threat, conventionally and on the nuclear front. With that change, Finland has to adapt, and the passing of this new law, or more accurately, the tearing to shreds of an old law, is Finland's way of accepting the reality it faces in the 2020s, while letting Putin know that he can't have everything his own way. Putin's goal, both with the Ukraine war and beyond, is to present Russia as a major threat to every country in Europe that doesn't ask how high when Putin says jump. The Ukraine invasion was supposed to be over in a flash, reinforcing that threat. But years of brutal fighting and failure on Russia's part to do what Putin threatened have only led to a years-long transformation in Finnish defense policy that has culminated in this. Nuclear weapons can now be moved through Finland, and that means the nuclear path to Russia is shorter than ever before. This decision also signals a change in the Finnish attitude toward nuclear weapons. Few in Finland actually want nukes on their territory. As the New York Times points out, Finland avoided joining NATO for decades, and it has a deep-seated and justified fear of nuclear proliferation due to its border with Russia. But Putin's actions have forced Finland to make a decision that, in an ideal world, it would never have made. And that is another blow to Putin. Fear was supposed to stop Finland from doing anything like this. Instead, Putin's actions have led to Finland accepting the maximum role it could take in NATO, perhaps out of necessity rather than desire, and that has transformed everything about Putin's plans for taking on NATO in the future. Let's look at the brass tacks of all of this. Now, Finland has no nuclear weapons program, which likely means that it also has no facilities in place for storing nukes. But that's not the point. What this decision has opened up is the possibility for nuclear weapons to be moved through and potentially launched from Finnish territory into Russia. And NATO's nukes are the great equalizer when it comes to dealing with Russia. According to Statista, NATO allies, which essentially amounts to the US, the UK and France as nuclear-capable nations, combined to bring 4,215 nuclear warheads to bear against Russia in 2026. The number used to be much higher during the height of the Cold War, when the nuclear arms race was at its pinnacle. Back in 1966, NATO allies had access to 31,492 nukes, with Russia having a similar number, which goes a long way toward explaining why Finland wanted to stay out of NATO for so long. But with Russia actively invading Ukraine and Russian threats spurring many, including Germany's Chief of Army Lieutenant General Christian Freuding, stating outright that NATO needs to be ready for war with Russia, the Cold War calculus no longer applies. Finland can't appease and avoid by staying out of Russia's crosshairs anymore. Instead, it has to point crosshairs of its own in Russia's direction, and this new decision is the perfect way to do it. For Russia, this doesn't just mean yet another European nation has approved stationing of nukes on its territory. This is the nation that is closer than any other to Russia, at least in regard to NATO's defense posture. The UK and France host nuclear weapons that they built themselves. Beyond that, 5 countries play host to US-made nuclear weapons: Germany, Belgium, Italy, Turkey, and the Netherlands. None of these weapons are armed or deployed on aircraft, the Arms Control Center points out. All are kept in WS-3 underground vaults at air bases, and none can be armed without the Permissive Action Link, or PAL, codes that the US controls. To be used, these nukes have to be loaded into dual-capable NATO fighter jets or bombers, and the US has to approve all of these and provide the PAL codes. On one hand, this does mean that Finland isn't an immediate nuclear threat to Russia. Plus, it has only just torn up its old laws. We don't yet know if the US is going to follow through by using Finnish air bases to store nukes. But on the other hand, the practicalities are all problems for the future. What's important right now is the message. NATO is getting stronger, and Finland lies at the heart of it all. Now, the nation that has the largest border with Russia out of all in the NATO alliance has said that it's ready to accept nuclear weapons. That alone is terrifying for Putin. Every threat that he has ever made to a NATO-aligned nation is coming back to haunt him, courtesy of the newest addition to the alliance. But to make matters even worse for Russia's president, Finland's nuclear decision isn't the only problem that he faces. Behind this major decision lies the bigger issue of NATO taking Russia more seriously as a conventional and nuclear threat than it has since the fall of the Soviet Union. That changes everything for Russia. But before we go deeper, this is a reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If this is the kind of insight that you want to see more of, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. Finland's massive nuclear decision came on the back of another huge NATO move that has Putin sweating. On June 8th, NATO announced that it has bolstered its posture in the high north and Arctic regions with the creation of the latest multinational Forward Land Forces, or FLF, that the alliance has available. That FLF began operations on June 6th and is stationed in Finland and Sweden. Though led by Sweden as the framework nation, FLF Finland is the 9th of NATO's FLFs, the first of which was established in 2017 to run across the Collective Defense Alliance's eastern flank. The decision to create this FLF was actually made in 2024, not long after Sweden and Finland joined NATO, so Russia would have known that it was coming. Now, don't get us wrong, this isn't a massive force. According to the Nordic defense sector, FLF Finland will consist of a Swedish battalion containing 600 soldiers, which is obviously not enough to stop Russia if it mounts a full invasion into the Nordic territories. But that isn't the point. For a start, FLF Finland can grow through contributions from other nations. In fact, the UK, Italy, France, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway have already announced that they will work alongside Sweden and Finland to develop the force, so 600 soldiers are the starting point, rather than the full might that FLF Finland will bring to bear. But more important than that is that FLF Finland means that NATO now has the ability to coordinate ground forces in a region that seems to be close to the top of the list for areas that Russia would choose to invade if Putin completely loses his mind and decides that failure in Ukraine means that Russia must escalate to all of Europe. And who knows, maybe this FLF will end up playing a part in developing Finland's new nuclear posture. Returning to the subject of nukes, Finland isn't alone in letting Putin know that he's going to get burned if he keeps on playing with fire. On June 18th, just a few days after Finland passed its new law, the UK Defence Journal reported that NATO's Nuclear Planning Group had issued a ministerial statement. That alone might not necessarily seem remarkable, but what's important about this statement is that it's the first that the NATO Nuclear Planning Group has released since 2007, and it was all about modernising NATO's nuclear capabilities and strengthening the alliance's nuclear planning capacity. The timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. This is NATO taking the knife that Finland just plunged into Putin's side and giving it a nice little twist. Now, the statement isn't anything too dramatic. It doesn't say that NATO is ready to launch nukes at Russia at a moment's notice. But what it does, said one unnamed NATO official, who the UK Defence Journal quotes, is show that NATO has shifted back from expeditionary warfare to an active policy of defence and deterrence in the Euro-Atlantic area. And that's not all. The same official says that the US is completely on board with this shift. Rubbishing claims that the US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth simply turned up to make opening remarks at the Brussels meeting where the statement was drafted, the official says that the US is fully leaning into NATO's nuclear sharing mission. It, along with France and the UK, is actively modernizing its nuclear forces, the official claims. They add that the US has repeatedly affirmed its nuclear guarantee to the rest of NATO, regardless of individual shifts. This statement was made despite reported adjustments to the B-52 bomber fleet and claims that the US is going to reduce the deep strike capabilities available to European NATO by withdrawing warships and cutting down on the number of F-16 and F-15E fighter jets available to NATO from the 150 it has now to 100. We mentioned timing a minute ago. And it's not just timing with Finland's decision that's notable here. NATO's new statement comes about a month after Russia held a 3-day exercise that involved Belarus and included 64,000 troops, 200 missile launchers, over 140 aircraft, 73 warships, 13 submarines, and 8 intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads, NBC News reports. Those exercises were clearly an attempt to threaten through nukes, as Russia has done so many times before, and there are suggestions that they focused on training troops on how to deploy the Oreshnik hypersonic missiles that are reportedly stationed in Belarus. Putin has been engaging in plenty of nuclear saber-rattling. Both Finland and NATO have combined to show Russia's leader that he isn't the only one with a saber that can be rattled. Interestingly, what we've just seen from Finland and NATO may be precisely what the European Council on Foreign Relations, or ECFR, said was needed in a June 17th piece where it labelled Russia the bear with the bomb. The ECFR's key argument was that European NATO needed to go into overtime to plug the gaps in its nuclear capabilities. However, the bulk of the article focused more on how European NATO needs to find a way to do this without US support, given the constant uncertainty about the US position on NATO under the Donald Trump administration. So perhaps we can see what Finland just did under a different light. If the US wants to station nukes in Finland, then great. The posture of the official who spoke to the UK Defence Journal is a reality and Russia faces a massive deterrent. But if for whatever reason the US withdraws nuclear weapons from Europe, Finland has still just made itself available to the UK and France as a potential site for their nukes, which still means there is a clear and very present threat to Russia if Putin goes beyond the conventional and gets too happy with the atomic trigger. The US nuclear umbrella is irreplaceable for the foreseeable future. Europeans cannot abandon it. But they must build something that approximates its deterrent effects, lest Russia's leaders see America abandoning its defense of Europe as an opportunity to apply their theory of victory, concepts, and capabilities, the ECFR declares. Perhaps we're seeing the first step toward building something that can mirror the current deterrent effects provided by the US. And if we are, Finland is right at the heart of it. Let's return to Finland as we round out the video. In recent months, Finland, along with other Nordic nations, has started to voice loud concerns over a Russian military buildup on their borders. Satellite photos show that this buildup, which includes the construction of new barracks and facilities, could be enough for Russia to station 115,000 troops on the borders of the Nordic and Baltic regions. All of this is happening as some within NATO suggest that a war with Russia could be coming in the next 3 to 5 years, GIS Reports says. So it's not as though Finland has just made its massive nuclear decision unprompted. It's done it, at least in part, because Russia is making it very clear that Putin is planning something. If that something is an invasion of NATO, then tens of thousands of troops on the Nordic and Baltic borders seems like a natural starting point. Finland needs to deter Russia from moving forward with these plans in any way that it can. The country's nuclear decision is the culmination of a full-blown evolution in defense posture that Finland has been undertaking for years. Except Finland hasn't spent the last few decades treating Russia casually. Yes, it stayed out of NATO until Putin forced the Finnish hand. But it's not as though Finland was completely neutral towards Russia either. As GIS Reports finds out, Finland was one of the few European countries that chose not to lower its guard once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. While others tried to welcome a new Russia, which has since developed into what we see today, Finland was quietly preparing for a fight that it always felt could be coming. We see hints of this in the Finnish military. Though Finland has just 24,000 active duty personnel in its army, it has reserves that number 870,000 and paramilitary forces of almost 54,000 in a country that has a population of a little more than 5.6 million people. Finland has never stopped training soldiers, and when Russia invaded Ukraine, pushing Finland into joining NATO in the process, we started to see why. Now that Finland is moving closer to battle mode, its preparation, which may have been seen as pointless in the 90s, is paying off. Along with Estonia, Finland controls access to the Gulf of Finland. That's leverage that can be used against Russia. The FLF we discussed earlier could balloon to 6,000 soldiers, GIS report says, and it, combined with Nordic air power supported by NATO, would enable the air superiority needed to prevent Russian access to the Gulf of Finland. And now, nuclear weapons are allowed to move through Finland. What all of this means is that Putin has a major Finland problem. And that problem is only going to get bigger from here. Now it's nukes along with all of the other preparations. Tomorrow it will be an even stronger Finland. In early June, Finland's Parliamentary Defense Committee proposed raising the country's defense expenditure from the $8.8 billion it is now to a little over $16 billion by 2029, and then maintaining spending at about $17.2 billion through to 2036. That proposal hasn't been accepted yet, but it perfectly showcases the mood that the Finns have toward Russia right now. Putin is a threat. Finland's response to that threat hasn't been to cower. It's been to show Putin that Russia can't intimidate Finland into backing away. The posture will only get stronger, the military spending will only get more pronounced, and if NATO makes the most out of Finland's nuclear decision, the deterrent posed to Russia will be more lethal than it has been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. As Russia faces all of these problems in Finland, it also has to deal with NATO strengthening elsewhere. The Baltic defense line is being bolstered, new defenses and military command structures are being created, all to signal to Putin that NATO will be ready if Russia is dumb enough to invade European NATO. Find out what all of these changes mean for the Baltic and Russia in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to see more of our coverage about the evolution of NATO's posture against Russia. And thank you for watching.